For 7 years, Daniel Brooks had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways. He imagined anger. He imagined tears. He even imagined a door slammed in his face. But he never imagined that the woman who once knew every dream hidden inside his heart would look into his eyes, as though he had become a stranger. That single question, "Have we met?" didn't erase his past. It forced him to relive it. Because the truth was, Daniel hadn't lost Eleanor that morning inside the glass tower. He lost her years earlier, on an ordinary evening, when he walked away from a woman who believed love wasn't measured by grand promises, but by the quiet choices people make every single day. The hardest lessons in life rarely arrive with warning. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments. Moments that seem too small to matter, until one day they become the memories that refuse to let us sleep. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if stories about love, resilience, and second chances speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Kimberly Storyhouse so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. Now, let's go back to the evening when everything changed. The rain had been falling since late afternoon. Inside a modest suburban home outside Boston, warm light spilled from the kitchen onto polished hardwood floors. Fresh bread had just come out of the oven. 2 dinner plates rested on the table. 2 glasses waited beside them. Everything looked exactly as it had, every weekday, for more than 20 years. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary home. It wasn't, because in less than an hour, one decision would unravel a marriage that had taken decades to build, and neither of them understood that what they were about to lose could never truly be replaced. Some moments don't change your life when they happen. They wait, quietly, patiently, until years later, they return and demand to be remembered. This is the story of a man who believed he was walking toward a better future, only to discover he had walked away from the greatest love he would ever know. 7 years after leaving the woman who built her world around him, he returned with one desperate request: just 5 minutes. What happened next wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about wealth. It was about something far more difficult: the price of realizing the value of someone's heart, only after they've learned how to live without yours. The sound of tires rolling onto the wet driveway was so familiar that Eleanor smiled before she even looked through the kitchen window. For 22 years, Daniel had come home the same way. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps. She knew the pause before he unlocked the front door. She even knew he would loosen his tie before saying a single word. Some people spend a lifetime learning a stranger. Eleanor had spent hers learning the smallest details about the man she loved. She had memorized the way he laughed when he was truly happy, the silence he carried after difficult meetings, and the gentle smile that appeared whenever she baked fresh bread. Love, she believed, wasn't found in grand vacations or expensive gifts. It was hidden inside ordinary evenings that slowly became extraordinary because they were shared with the right person. That belief had carried her through more than 2 decades of marriage. She had no reason to think tonight would be any different. She reached for the coffee pot, poured his favorite dark roast into the blue ceramic mug he always used, and placed it beside his dinner plate while steam curled gently toward the ceiling. Everything was ready before he stepped inside. She glanced at the clock. 6 o'clock. Right on time. The front door opened, but instead of hearing the familiar, "I'm home," she heard nothing at all. Daniel walked into the house carrying a suitcase instead of his briefcase. He never looked toward the dining table. He never noticed the flowers she had picked that morning or the candle she had lit before sunset. His eyes remained fixed on the staircase. Eleanor laughed softly, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Perhaps another unexpected business trip. Perhaps something urgent at work. She followed him upstairs, still holding the dish towel in her hands, never imagining she was following him toward the moment that would divide her life into 2 completely different chapters. Daniel opened the bedroom closet and quietly removed one shirt after another. Each hanger scraped against the metal rail with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud inside the silent room. Eleanor stood in the doorway, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. He folded another shirt, then another. Finally, she whispered his name. He stopped moving but didn't turn around. The silence between them stretched longer than either of them had ever experienced. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded unfamiliar, almost as though someone else had borrowed it. He said he couldn't keep living this way. Eleanor searched every corner of her mind for an argument they might have forgotten, a misunderstanding she could fix, some invisible problem she had somehow failed to notice. Instead, she found only confusion. Their marriage hadn't been filled with shouting or betrayal. It had been filled with birthdays, grocery lists, hospital visits for aging parents, mortgage payments, anniversaries, quiet evenings on the porch, and ordinary mornings that slowly became years. To Eleanor, that wasn't something to escape. That was the life they had promised to build together. Daniel finally turned to face her, and for the first time she noticed something missing from his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was distance. The kind that doesn't appear overnight, but grows one unnoticed day at a time until two people are standing only a few feet apart, yet feel impossibly far away. He admitted there was someone else. The words didn't arrive with cruelty. They arrived with exhaustion. Eleanor felt as though the room itself had stopped breathing. She looked toward the wedding photograph resting on the dresser. Two smiling faces stared back at her, completely unaware of the years waiting ahead. Slowly, she picked up the frame and brushed away a thin layer of dust with her thumb. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Was there a moment when you stopped seeing the life we built? Or did you simply stop seeing me? Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came. Sometimes silence reveals more truth than words ever could. And in that silence, both of them understood that the evening they thought would end with dinner was ending with goodbye. Daniel never answered her question. He simply lowered his eyes, zipped the suitcase, and reached for the bedroom door. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was something far more painful. Finality. Eleanor watched the man she had loved for more than half her life walk past the framed photographs, the bookshelf they had built together one summer, and the hallway where birthday decorations had once hung for children who never came. Every corner of the house carried a memory, yet Daniel walked through it as though he were passing through a hotel room he would never visit again. The front door closed with a soft click, almost gentle, and that somehow hurt more than if he had slammed it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with every conversation they would never have, every anniversary they would never celebrate, and every promise that would never be fulfilled. Eleanor remained standing exactly where he had left her until the coffee on the kitchen table became cold enough to reflect the ceiling light like a tiny mirror. The following morning arrived exactly on schedule. Birds still sang outside the bedroom window. The neighborhood children still waited for the school bus. The mailman still walked from house to house. The world continued as though nothing had changed. That was the first lesson Heartbreak taught her. Life doesn't stop because someone's heart does. She got dressed, made the bed, opened the curtains, and even prepared breakfast before realizing there was no one left to serve. She sat alone at the dining table staring at two plates she had placed out of habit. Slowly, she removed one and returned it to the cupboard. Then she picked up the second plate and quietly ate breakfast in complete silence. No dramatic breakdown. No shattered dishes. Just a woman trying to understand how a house filled with furniture could suddenly feel completely empty. Later that afternoon, she walked into their bedroom and noticed a space inside the closet where Daniel's clothes had once hung. She reached toward the empty hangers without thinking, then stopped herself. Sometimes the smallest absences leave the deepest wounds. Days became weeks, and the phone rarely rang. Friends didn't know what to say, so many said nothing at all. A few invited her out for coffee, but most conversations ended with advice she hadn't asked for. You'll find someone else. Everything happens for a reason. Time heals all wounds. Eleanor smiled politely every time she heard those words, but deep inside they felt hollow. She wasn't looking for another husband. She wasn't searching for quick answers. She was trying to remember who she had been before she became someone's wife. One rainy afternoon, she opened the bottom drawer of her bedside table looking for important documents. Instead, she found an old leather sketchbook covered in a thin layer of dust. Her fingertips hesitated before lifting the cover. Inside were dozens of architectural drawings she had made in college. Community centers, libraries, schools, homes designed for families she had imagined would one day fill them with life. She hadn't looked at those pages in more than 20 years. She turned each page slowly until tears blurred the pencil lines. Somewhere between marriage, work, responsibilities, and routine, she had quietly placed her own dreams inside a drawer and forgotten where she left them. Across town, Daniel's new apartment looked exactly like the life he believed he wanted. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Expensive furniture filled every room. Olivia loved hosting friends, spontaneous weekend trips, and evenings that stretched long into the night. At first, Daniel convinced himself he had finally found the excitement he had been missing. Every photograph on social media showed smiling faces, rooftop dinners, and beach vacations. People congratulated him for starting over. Some even admitted they envied his courage. What none of them saw was what happened after the photographs were taken. The quiet drives home where neither of them spoke. The meals eaten while scrolling separate phones. The growing realization that excitement fades much faster than companionship. One evening, after another argument over something neither of them could remember 10 minutes later, Olivia looked across the room and sighed. "You've changed." Daniel frowned. "Changed how?" She shrugged. "You don't laugh the way you used to. You're somewhere else even when you're sitting right here." Those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended because, for the first time, he wondered if he had carried the emptiness with him instead of leaving it behind. Months later, Eleanor enrolled in evening architecture classes at a local university. She worked mornings at a neighborhood bookstore, spent afternoons studying, and stayed awake long after midnight sketching designs at her kitchen table. The first licensing exam ended in failure. So did the second. She cried in the parking lot, wiped away her tears before anyone could notice, and returned home with another stack of textbooks. Every setback became another reason to keep going instead of another excuse to quit. Slowly, something inside her began to change. The woman who had once measured her worth by whether someone chose to stay started measuring it by the courage to keep moving even after they left. She didn't become stronger overnight. She became stronger one ordinary day at a time. And while Daniel spent his evenings wondering why the life he chased never brought him peace, Eleanor quietly began building a future neither of them could yet imagine. Years passed so quietly that neither of them noticed how completely life had changed. Eleanor's small apartment eventually gave way to a modest office with a single drafting table, then 2 employees, then 5, and finally an architectural firm known throughout the state for designing schools, libraries, community centers, and affordable housing projects that placed people before profit. Every building carried the same philosophy. A home wasn't measured by the size of its walls. It was measured by the peace people felt once they stepped inside. Clients admired her work, city officials praised her vision, and young architects competed for the chance to learn from her. Yet every Friday afternoon, Eleanor quietly left the office carrying a small box of pastries to the neighborhood bookstore where she had once worked. She would sit with the owner over coffee, smiling as though nothing remarkable had happened. Success had changed her circumstances, but it hadn't changed her heart. She never forgot the people who believed in her before anyone else did. Somewhere along the way, she stopped wondering whether Daniel regretted leaving. That question no longer controlled her mornings or kept her awake at night. She had discovered something more valuable than revenge. She had discovered peace. Daniel's world moved in the opposite direction. His second marriage slowly unraveled beneath the weight of disappointments neither of them knew how to repair. Olivia eventually packed her belongings with the same quiet determination Eleanor had shown years earlier. There were no dramatic arguments. Only a final conversation neither of them could avoid. She admitted she no longer recognized the man she had fallen in love with. Daniel wanted to argue, but every reason he thought of sounded strangely familiar. After she left, the apartment felt larger than ever before. Weeks later, the marketing firm, where he had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, announced major restructuring. His position disappeared along with dozens of others. The phone that once rang constantly became silent. Invitations stopped arriving. People who had celebrated his success slowly disappeared once there was nothing left to celebrate. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning a storage box he had ignored for years, he discovered a bundle of unopened envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. They were all addressed in Eleanor's handwriting. Business trips, anniversaries, birthdays, ordinary Tuesdays. He had been too busy to read them then. Now he opened every one. Inside each letter was the same quiet love he had spent years searching for in louder places. By the time he reached the final page, tears had blurred the ink beyond recognition. For the first time since leaving home, Daniel understood that the greatest mistake of his life wasn't falling in love with someone else. It was failing to recognize the extraordinary love that had been waiting for him every evening at his own dinner table. The next morning, he searched for Eleanor's name online. Hundreds of photographs appeared. Magazine interviews, award ceremonies, community projects. There she stood in front of buildings she had designed, smiling beside families she had never met before, changing their lives forever. One article caught his attention. It described Eleanor Brooks as an architect who believed every person deserved a place where they felt safe, respected, and valued. Daniel read that sentence again and again until his hands began to shake. Those weren't ideas she had learned after the divorce. Those were the values she had lived by throughout their marriage. He had simply been too distracted to see them. Within an hour, he was driving toward the headquarters of Brooks and Carter Architecture with nothing except the bundle of letters resting on the passenger seat. Every mile brought another memory. The first apartment they rented. The picnic where he proposed. The nights she waited awake until he returned from business trips. He realized memory has a strange way of returning all at once, especially when regret finally removes the noise that once drowned it out. By the time he reached the city, he wasn't rehearsing an apology anymore. He was praying for a chance to say one. That was the moment you witnessed at the beginning of this story. The desperate footsteps across polished marble, the trembling hands, the security guards, the receptionist's uncertain expression, the elevator doors opening, Eleanor walking forward with the quiet confidence that only years of healing can build. Daniel had imagined she would be angry. Instead, she was calm. Somehow, that was even harder to face. When he finally apologized, every word came from a place stripped of pride. He admitted he had mistaken comfort for emptiness and confused constant excitement with lasting happiness. He admitted that he had spent years chasing a feeling while abandoning the person who had given his life its deepest meaning. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the old letters resting in his hands before gently returning them to him. Her voice carried neither bitterness nor satisfaction. She simply thanked him for coming, told him she had forgiven him long ago, and explained that forgiveness does not always rebuild what has already been broken. Some doors close because they are meant to protect the person who finally found the courage to walk through another one. Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time, he wasn't searching for another chance. He was accepting the truth. As Daniel turned toward the revolving doors, sunlight poured through the glass walls and stretched across the marble floor where he had stood only minutes before. He paused one last time, looked back at Eleanor, and smiled with quiet gratitude. "You built something beautiful," he whispered. Eleanor looked around the office, watching young architects discussing blueprints and interns laughing over coffee before answering with the words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "I didn't build this first," she said softly. "I built myself." Daniel walked away carrying the same leather folder he had brought into the building, but he left with something far heavier than paperwork. He left with understanding. Eleanor watched the revolving doors close, then returned to the meeting waiting for her upstairs. Life continued exactly as it should. Outside, children played in one of the parks her company had designed. Inside, another project that would serve thousands of families was ready to begin. The greatest victory she ever achieved wasn't becoming successful after heartbreak. It was becoming someone who no longer measured her future by the choices another person had made. If this story reminded you that healing is possible, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because stories have a remarkable way of connecting strangers. And if you believe that the strongest endings are the ones that help someone begin again, subscribe to Kimberly Storyhouse. Sometimes the people who leave our lives also leave behind the lesson that changes them forever. The question is never whether life gives us another chapter. The question is what we choose to write when the page finally turns.